Hi, today's video is going to be about the NuTone 313 series of music intercom systems. You might have noticed that I referred to it as the 313 series as opposed to a specific model number of this unit that you're looking at right now. And the reason I did that is because the 313 series is the second most modified and updated model that NuTone ever made. There are actually 5 distinctly different versions of the 313, and I'm going to go over those briefly with you before we talk about this particular example right here. So the original IM313 was introduced in 1974 along with its cousin model, the IM303. Both the IM303 and IM313 replaced all previous 3-wire models, and it featured a lot of new improvements in design over those earlier systems. The way to look at an IM313 is an enhanced version of the more basic IM303 model. So if we draw a line right here halfway through the unit, everything below this line is basically an IM303. You have AM/FM radio with room-to-room intercom. Everything above the line is what makes it a 313. As NuTone did in those days, to create new and different models, they would add new and different features to an existing model and create something brand new. So a 303, the bottom half, is converted or transformed into a 313 by adding a cassette player recorder, a clock, and the ability to leave messages. And that's why it's referred to as a Commu-Ni-Center, because it was supposed to be the communication center of the house. When the IM313 was introduced in 1974, it featured all new electronics, and they were much more sophisticated in their design than the previous 3-wire models. It had a much more sophisticated amplifier design. It featured radio muting when you operated the intercom, and of course it had the cassette player and a clock. Now, I don't have an example of an IM313 because they're rather hard to come by, but we do have a picture of one right here on the service manual. And you'll see here it has its cassette player right here, and it was always rumored that the cassette player in the IM313 was actually made by Panasonic. And these are easy to identify because they have these long rectangular brushed chrome covered operation buttons here on the panel. Alongside the cassette player, we have this large digital display clock. And while you might think that's just a standard LED or vacuum fluorescent display clock, it isn't. It's actually something pretty cool. It's a piece of pretty cool mid or early 70s technology. It's called an Illumotime Morphing digital clock. And it's actually an all mechanical device. Behind the display that you see here, there's a series of gears and an electric motor. And the electric motor turns the gears, and it moves these series of plastic masks with slots in them, and they slide and move back and forth, creating the gaps, and the gaps make the numbers. And then there's lamps behind it so the light shows through the gaps, and that's what makes the numbers show up on the display. There was a large Japanese manufacturer called Tamura, and they made a lot of Illumotime morphing clocks. A lot of them that I found were simple table clocks or in clock radios, and they even made a few wall clocks, and apparently they're quite collectible because they go for a lot of money. But it was sort of a cool way to have a digital clock that wasn't at all electronic. So that's the IM313 from 1974. Now we jump ahead to 1976, and we have our first revision. It becomes an IMA313, and at the same time, the 303 was revised and it became an IMA303. Since the two models are tied together in design, there's a lot of similarities. There was a lot of updating done for the IMA313. It was, for the most part, a complete redo of the radio intercom electronics in the unit. It had a much more sophisticated amplifier power supply design. They moved away from a Darlington amplifier design to a single monolithic IC amplifier, and the other components to support that. And it also received a more sophisticated AM/FM tuner design. The cassette player and the Untitled Morphing Clock remains the same, as did the appearance of the unit. It was just an overall update to keep pace with the IMA 303. Now we jump ahead 3 years to 1979, and we have our third revision, and it becomes the IMB 313. And there was a lot of changes with the IMB 313 in that the Untitled Morphing Clock is now gone, and we have our first true 8-segment red LED clock with the addition of a built-in weather radio. The weather radio was an interesting idea. Weather radio would continually monitor the frequencies from the National Weather Service, and if it detected a warning tone that would be sent out before the emergency broadcast, it would automatically override the AM/FM radio and play the weather alert notification throughout the house over the intercom stations. Of course, for this to work, the system would have to be turned on, and it would have to be in AM or FM modes, but I think most people knew that, so that's pretty much how it worked. So it was a novel idea. The master station actually included 3 different crystals which would be installed in the weather radio assembly, and the crystals were divided up for use in different parts of the country based on where you lived. As a side note, also in 1979, with the introduction of the IMB 313, there was a service kit that NuTone had available for the earlier IM and IMA 313s. If for some reason those earlier models you have to replace the faceplate assembly or the cassette player or the clock, they made a faceplate repair kit, and it included a brand new faceplate with the LED clock and the weather radio. It was sort of an upgrade to the original model. Now we jump ahead to 1984. In 1984, we have the all-new IMC 313, which looks very much like the one we have on display here, but this is not an IMC. So in 1984, with the IMC introduction, we have more updates. We have a newly updated amplifier design. We have an all-new AM/FM tuner design. We have an all-new cassette player, which is very similar to this one here. And it was also, again, rumored that this cassette player was made by Panasonic, but it is distinctly different than the earlier ones. And we have an all-new LED display module assembly that was made by National Semiconductor. And finally, in 1986, we have the last and final version, which is the IMD 313. That takes us through all 5 different versions of a 313. This happens to be an actual IMD 313, and this one is from the end of 1985. There are actually very few changes between an IMC and an IMD. Primarily, they are small electronic changes to the boards in the unit or modifications that were made to solve probably little problems that came about in the field in the real world. So C's and D's are very much the same. So let's take a look at an IMD 313 and see what we actually have. A lot of this is very similar to an IM or IMA 303. Down here on the bottom we have our AM and FM tuning scales, and you turn the knob and the pointer moves back and forth. We have a 4-position input selection switch. We have FM, tape, phono, and AM. And yes, you do, if you're going to listen to the cassette player, you do have to put it on in the tape position. There is no automatic override when you operate the cassette player. You have our primary on-off switch, and this is the type of design that when you turn the knob down and click it off, it is truly off, except for the fact that the clock still operates, the weather radio is still on, but the rest of the unit is actually turned off. We have our intercom controls here. The IM313 and all of its variations was the first model that enhanced the intercom operation on a 3-wire design. Previous 3-wire models, when you would operate the intercom while the music was playing, you would be speaking over the music. It didn't mute the music in any way. The 313, it has a muting circuit built into it, And the way that operates is if you have the radio playing throughout the house and you go up and you push talk on one of the stations, it causes the music to slowly fade out and disappear. And as long as you operate the controls, the music stays muted. And then once you stop pushing the buttons, the radio music fades back in again and you can hear it. So you're not speaking over the music, you're muting it as you speak. 313 was also the first design that had door communication that was available at every station. Here on the master station we have door, talk, and listen, and on the remote stations you also have door, talk, and listen. It's also one of the first systems that the music does not play outside through the door station, and the door station does not have any intercom controls on it. For privacy reasons, door communication is all controlled from inside the house. It's also the first series that came out that had the feature that later would be referred to as hands-free reply to the master. And what we have here on the master station for inside and patio speakers is we have both a talk and a listen button. The idea behind this was if someone initiates a call at the master station, you could push talk and call to someone in the house, and then you could simply push listen and the person could answer back. They didn't have to go right to the speaker and they didn't have to operate the controls. Now, if a call was initiated from a remote station or if it was from room to room, not including the master, then it was like the old systems where it was like walkie-talkies where one person would push and talk and the other person had to push to answer back. Here on the bottom left-hand corner of the master station where it says Commu-Ni-Center, the door flips down and the model number information is inside the door in case you don't know which one you have. This one is an IMD 313, and here we have our 8 room control switches. Each switch has 3 different positions. In the bottom position, that station has both radio and intercom. The center position is off, and the top position is what they called listen in, which later would become monitor. You have 2 adjustments here. You have volume, all speakers. This is for the radio volume throughout the house. And then you have a tone control here, which we all used to say you have treble or less treble. Not a lot of bass on these models. There is no separate intercom volume adjustment. On the later models, the intercom volume was preset as part of the design of the circuit board, and it was 8 decibels louder than the music typically. On the earlier versions, the IMs through the IMBs, there is actually an adjustment wheel on the back of the amplifier board that you could somewhat adjust the intercom volume. There was some compromise between its volume and the volume to all speakers adjustment. It was a little tricky to get it right. In most cases, everybody's got everything cranked up to full, which is not necessarily the best way to do it. Here we have our cassette player recorder assembly. This particular one, which was donated by a local customer after a remodel, this one still has its cassette tape cover in place, and you can take this off and store it away. This is possibly one of the most lost items. I think in most houses this little cover got thrown away probably within the first week of somebody moving into the house, but it covers up the cassette tape here, which the fellow was obviously nice enough to leave in for us. Ooh, it's a Maxwell, good quality. How many people remember buying Maxwell cassettes when they were in high school? And here we have our cassette player assembly. Part of the other idea of the cover here, which has sides on it, is to help keep dirt and dust out of the cassette player assembly and off the heads and rollers and so forth, so it stays clean. But we can take this off. And then we have our pretty standard cassette player controls. We have stop, play, fast forward, rewind, and record. Like most cassette players, you can't press record unless you have a tape in place and the little tab has not been broken out. So this just pops in here like this, and now we can press record. We'd have to press play with it also to raise the transport assembly. Pretty basic stuff. Up here on the top of the unit, next to where it says Message Center, because we all need to be reminded of what it's for, we have 2 switches here. We have this switch on the right, which has 2 positions, which is normal and record message. And so if mom wants to leave a message for the kids that she's running out to pick up the dog from the dog groomer, she would slide this to record message, and it pushes the second switch into its position also, which would light up the neon light behind the indicator here. And then mom would press record and play together and leave her message and then stop. and this light would remain on, and when the kids come home from school, they could rewind, listen to the message, and realize that they're on their own until mom gets back. I don't know if a lot of people actually did that or not, but it was always a novel idea. And then here, of course, we have our 8-segment LED clock. We have 2 sets of buttons here. We have time set, which is fast and slow, and then weather radio on and off. Weather radios are not, and weather alerts are not really common in California, at least not when I was growing up. Nowadays we have more severe weather alerts. It seems like if you push the on button and there's nothing coming through from the National Weather Service, all you do is get a lot of static. And then off would turn it off. I guess if you had an alert, you'd go back to music before you ran down to the basement and hide from the tornado. And looking on the back of the unit, you can see there's a lot going on here, so let's just go over it briefly. Here we have in this lower left-hand corner, this is the AM/FM tuner assembly. This was the final version of the AM/FM tuner. It's basically the AM/FM tuner version that was used all the way from about 1979 through the end of 1984 in almost all NuTone radio intercom master stations. Here we have sitting next to it this little rectangular board. This is the Intercom Talk Listen module, and it's what makes the intercom operate the way it does. We have the input selector switch, the on-off volume control, our intercom switches here, and then in the lower right-hand corner, this is our terminal board assembly. There were a lot of different terminal board designs on all of the 3-wire systems made between 74 and 84. All of them have their challenges when wiring them up because you have a lot of connections on a fairly small board. This was perhaps the most organized version that they made, and they actually went through the trouble to color code the different sections of it to make it easier for the installer to hook up the wires. Up here we have our 5-inch 25 ohm speaker cone. This is this board right here. This is the weather radio board, and I talked about the crystals that you would install, and right here we can unplug this. This is one of the crystals that came with the set. This is actually crystal number 1, and crystal number 1, if we consult our manual, is set at 162.55 megahertz. And I believe that's channel number 2 in the National Weather Radio Service broadcast system. And I don't remember what part of the country that's for. But you would get a little envelope with 3 of these in them, and then the installer was responsible for choosing the correct one for the area that the system was going to be installed in. I think a lot of the times, I've seen a lot of these sets where there's no crystal installed at all because the guy didn't read the instructions. So this is the weather radio. You'll notice here that the weather radio, this is the antenna coax cable. Unfortunately, the fella cut off the end, which is not cool, but it ties into the AM/FM dipole antenna that came with the rough-in kit. It feeds the signal into the weather radio board, and then there's an output and another cable here which goes down to the AM/FM tuner for the AM/FM radio signals. Behind this board is the clock display assembly board, and then in front of that is the actual display modules. The clock display module is a sealed self-contained unit. It was made by National Semiconductor, and it incorporates the 4 8-segment red LED display assemblies along with the LED driver underneath the display. Here we have the message center board with the 2 switches and the neon light. And then here under this big chrome cover is our cassette player assembly. The cassette player assembly is a sub-assembly of the rest of the unit, and it actually could be removed completely and not affect the operation of the rest of the unit. And then buried down here underneath all the tangle of wires, we'll unplug our terminal board connection to get it out of the way. Down here is our power supply and amplifier board. Here you can see the blue socket. This is where the end of the terminal board assembly plugs into it. It's a somewhat crude design where you have this little circuit board with these large mounted up solder pads, and it simply plugs into the blue plug here. You always want to be careful when you unplug or plug this back in. The blue plastic in the socket assembly, they tend to get brittle with age, and if you rock it back and forth like this, when you try to unplug it, you can crack the blue socket, and then it won't make the proper connections and the system won't work right. So you have to be careful when you do that. Here you can see this is our, down inside this metal heatsink, this is our monolithic amplifier IC that was incorporated into the new designs with the IMA 313 in 1976. And we also have over here a secondary low voltage transformer, which is powering our display and weather radio assembly. There you have it, the history of the NuTone 313 series, the second most updated model that NuTone ever made. I hope you found this video to be interesting and helpful. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up on YouTube because that always helps. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell or on the wheel, put in your email address, and every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.